Good afternoon. I'm Nisha Tank and I'm Head of School Improvement at the National Literacy Trust, and a very warm welcome to the first of our webinars for the National Year of Reading, exploring routes into reading for young people. The webinar is going to be led by Dr. Christina Clark, our Director of Research and Evaluation at the National Literacy Trust, and it's going to draw on our very latest research into young people's reading habits, what their biggest needs are, and how we can best respond to those. Christina has published over 180 reports on children's, young people's and adults' literacy since joining the National Literacy Trust in 2005, and she is a renowned national and international researcher in this field. She's positioned the National Literacy Trust as an evidence-based organisation that conducts high-quality research. We're also delighted to be joined by Sarah McGann, who is Professor of Literacy at Edinburgh University, and Sarah's research around young people's motivation and engagement with reading centres around the perspectives and the experiences of the young people themselves. And today she's going to be sharing her findings and the implications for our own practice. This session will be recorded and you will receive a link to the recording afterwards. The recording is there for you to rewatch, but also to use to support staff in your settings with professional development on this theme. We won't have the chat function open today, but we are running a closed Q&A function, and that's the opportunity for you to pose questions to Christina and Sarah. They're always very keen to hear your questions from out there in the field, and they've both kindly offered to respond to those questions in writing after the seminar, and we're going to make those responses available to everybody who has joined today. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm sure it's a busy day for you, and we're so pleased to have you with us here at the end of the day, and it's my very great pleasure to hand over to Christina. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nisha, and hello, everyone. So today I want to focus about what our latest evidence tells us about teenage reading, what's changing, why adolescence matters so much, and how young people themselves describe their experiences of reading. And some of this will already be familiar, but there's lots of new stuff hot off the press from a report that we will be publishing in a few weeks' time. And as you might know, while the National Year of Reading looks at reading across the lifespan, from shared reading in the early years all the way to adult reading engagement, it has broad focus on teenagers and teenage boys in particular. And that focus reflects what happens in early adolescence as academic pressures ramp up, free time shrinks, independence increases, and identities begin to shift. All of this affects how reading fits or doesn't fit into young people's everyday lives. Next, please. And double next. To understand why this focus on teenagers matters now, it helps to zoom out briefly and look at the wider context. What the research shows us from our own data and from a wide body of research from across the sector is that there's a generational decline in reading engagement, beginning in the early years and continuing through childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. We see this in changes to home reading environments, in declining levels of shared reading in the early years, in consistent drops in reading engagement among children and young people, and in adult reading levels. And the key point here is that the decline in reading is long-term and systemic. It reflects wider cultural change in how people spend their time, how they access stories and information, and what feels relevant in everyday life. And that context matters because it helps us understand both the scale of the challenge and the kind of response that's needed. Next, please. Within that wider picture, children and young people's experiences of reading are particularly telling. And when we look more closely at the data, a very clear picture emerges. We've been tracking children and young people's reading enjoyment for over 20 years, where we define reading broadly to include books, magazines, newspapers, comics, graphic novels, and other texts read in print and on screen. And what this graph shows is a sustained long-term decline rather than a short-term fluctuation. So if we look at the most recent data, the bar in red, only 1 in 3 children and young people aged 8 to 18 said in 2025 that they enjoyed reading. And while the most recent year shows a smaller drop than the year before, perhaps, over the past 20 years, enjoyment of reading in free time has fallen by nearly 19 percentage points. And what this tells us is that for many children and young people, reading is becoming less likely to be something they choose for themselves. Next. Enjoyment of reading, however, is only part of the picture, and one might argue that a more practical measure of the status of reading in children and young people's lives is to look at how many choose to read in their free time. So alongside tracking reading enjoyment, we also look at how often they read, particularly how many read daily. And when we look at that, in many ways, the picture for daily reading is even more challenging than it is for enjoyment. Just 1 in 5 children and young people now say they read something in their free time. And more worryingly, over the past 20 years, the number of children and young people who say this has halved. Now, this doesn't mean that children and young people aren't engaging with stories, information, ideas. Many of them do so regularly, but often in formats or spaces that don't always feel like reading to them or that aren't always recognized as such. Next. Before we narrow our focus to teenage reading, it's perhaps worth pausing on why this matters. Nothing on the slide will be a surprise to anyone working in schools or in literacy. Reading engagement supports language development, comprehension, and access to the curriculum more widely. But reading supports so much more than attainment. For many young people, it's a way to relax, switch off, and make sense of the world around them and make sense of them as beings. It's closely linked to well-being, mental health, empathy, and identity. So when reading engagement declines, the implications extend well beyond academic outcomes alone. It affects how young people cope, how they understand themselves and others, and how equipped they feel to navigate an increasingly complex world. Next. So we know that overall reading enjoyment and daily reading are both much lower now than they were 20 years ago. If we break this down by age, we can start to see where in young people's lives these declines are most pronounced and where reading engagement is most fragile. The graph on the left shows that reading enjoyment declines as children move into adolescence, particularly between the ages of 8 to 11 and 11 to 14. We also know that this is a period of significant transition, academically, socially, and emotionally, and reading enjoyment is clearly affected by that shift. But daily reading, the graph on the right, tells an even stronger story. Over the same age range, daily reading falls much more sharply than enjoyment. And by early adolescence, reading every day is no longer the norm for many young people. And that gap between enjoyment and frequency matters. It suggests that many young people don't stop valuing reading as such, but they stop doing it regularly. And once that habit goes, it becomes much harder to sustain reading as part of everyday life. Next. I've prepared this slide for us today to help us understand whether lower reading enjoyment among teenagers is a new phenomenon or something more long-standing. And what we can see here is that over the past 20 years, older children and teenagers consistently reported lower enjoyment of reading than younger children. So lower enjoyment in adolescence is not new. It's been a feature of our data for at least the past 20 years. What has changed is the scale of the decline and where it is most pronounced. So between 2005 and 2025, reading enjoyment has fallen across all age groups, but the drop was much steeper among younger groups. So enjoyment fell by around 21 percentage points for those aged 8 to 11, and by nearly 15 points for those aged 11 to 14. By contrast, the decline among older teenagers was much smaller. And this tells us two things. First, adolescence has long been a period of lower reading enjoyment. And second, recent declines have hit early adolescence particularly hard, deepening an already fragile stage for reading engagement. Next, the long-term picture for daily reading is even more striking. As with environment, daily reading has always been less common among older children and teenagers than among younger children. But when we look at how this has changed over time, the steepest drops are again concentrated around early adolescence. Over the past 20 years, daily reading fell by 9 percentage points among those aged 8 to 11, but by a whopping 27 points among those aged 11 to 14. Older teens also saw declines, but they were again much smaller. Now, these are not small shifts at the margins. They represent a fundamental weakening of regular reading during a key developmental stage. And together, they show that while lower reading engagement in adolescence is not new, the extent of disengagement we are now seeing is unprecedented. And this helps explain why adolescence has become such a critical focus for both policy and practice. Next. So far, we've been looking at how often teenagers read and whether they enjoy it. The next question is what reading looks like when it does happen. And fiction remains a central part of teenage reading, and actually that has been true for a long time. Many teenagers continue to read fiction and nonfiction, as well as comic and graphic novels, particularly in print. At the same time, teenagers have always read across a range of formats, including lyrics, news, and online content, often alongside other activities. So the change we're seeing isn't really about what teenagers read, but about how hard it is to keep reading alongside everything else in their lives. Next slide, please. Having looked at what teenagers read, the next question is why they read at all. And when young people explain why they read, they tend to focus on three things. Most often, they talk about curiosity, reading to learn new things, discover new topics, or build their knowledge. Many also talk about how reading makes them feel. So reading is often described as a way to relax, switch off, or manage emotions. Much less often, young people talk about reading for social reasons, such as connecting with others or engaging with causes they care about. What's important here is that these challenge the idea that teenagers don't value reading. When they do read, many young people see it as meaningful for learning, for well-being, or both, even if reading no longer happens regularly. Next. Which leads us to the next question. What helps when the intention to read is low? When we ask young people who don't read often, what would make a difference, the answers are remarkably consistent. Relevance, autonomy, and personal interests matter most. Things like media tie-ins, content linked to hobbies and interests, eye-catching covers and titles, having the freedom to choose what, how, and when they read, and recommendations from trusted people all help. The insight here is that many young people aren't rejecting reading itself. They're rejecting experiences of reading that don't feel relevant to their lives. Next. It's perhaps natural at this point to ask whether what we're seeing is primarily a gender issue. Much of the public and policy conversations about teenage reading focuses on boys, and our own data shows that boys' reading enjoyment and daily reading, amongst other things, are lower than girls at every age. So boys clearly matter in the conversation. But it's also important to be careful here. Falling reading engagement during adolescence cannot be understood as a boys-only issue. When we look at the data by age and gender, the key difference is not whether the decline happens, but how it unfolds. Both boys and girls show declines in reading enjoyment and daily reading as they move into adolescence. But it's actually the drop in girls' enjoyment in daily reading that is initially more pronounced than that for boys. However, girls' reading tends to stabilize and partially recover later in the teenage years, while boys' enjoyment tends to remain persistently low. So I think this sets up an important reframing. Boys are central to the conversation not because they're uniquely disengaged from reading, but because they're less likely to recover once engagement drops. And understanding why that recovery happens for some groups and not others is crucial to how reading can be better supported during adolescence. Next, perhaps a useful starting point is what motivates boys and girls to read. And across both genders, the most commonly reported motivations are what we describe as those curious ones, reading to learn new things, to build knowledge and to deepen understanding. Where clear gender differences emerge is in the mindful motivations, which relate to the emotional well-being, where more girls than boys say that they read to relax, to escape, to feel happy, or to deal with emotions. However, it's also important not to overinterpret this. While it's true that fewer boys than girls report mindful motivations, reading to relax is the third most commonly cited motivation for boys, even if it sits behind that of girls and learning-related reasons. Now, this tells us that both boys and girls value reading for many of the same reasons, particularly learning and curiosity. The biggest differences lie in how strongly emotional and reflective motivations are articulated, and we return to that in a second. So next, if motivations tell us why boys and girls read when they already do, the next question is what might encourage them to read more often? And overall, as you can see, more girls than boys selected every single influence we ask about. But the size of these differences matters, and that is where the insight, I think, lies. The biggest gender gaps relate to social and external prompts. So more girls than boys, that they would be encouraged by book-related content on social media, for example, by recommendations, or by hearing about popular books. This suggests that visible reading cultures and social endorsement play a much stronger role in encouraging reading among girls in adolescence. However, at the same time, for both boys and girls, the strongest motivators related to choice and personal relevance. So, for example, many boys said that they would be more likely to read if they could find books that matched their interests, or if a book linked to a film or a television series that they had watched. And while it's true that girls selected those options more often, they remain among the most powerful influences for boys. And I think this suggests that while girls are responsive to a wider range of social prompts, boys are particularly motivated by reading that directly connects to their interests and media habits, which in turn highlights the importance of offering choice and recognizing different routes into reading. And before I hand over to Sarah, I want to finish this section next by looking more closely at boys' experiences of reading in secondary school, drawing on our qualitative data. And in 2025, more than 40,000 young people shared open-ended comments with us about reading. And across this qualitative data, many boys are clear that reading has value. They talk about reading as something that can support learning, provide information, and sometimes even be interesting, even when it no longer features regularly in their lives. But what stands out is how boys tend to frame that value. Boys often describe reading in functional or instrumental terms, something that is useful, helps them achieve or support schoolwork. This mirrors what we see in the survey data, where boys are more likely than girls to emphasize what reading does for them, rather than how it makes them feel. And boys' comments also help us understand how reading can persist, even in the absence of strong enjoyment. Many boys describe continuing to read weekly or monthly, not because they particularly enjoy it, but because reading serves a purpose or has become part of a routine. And this aligns with our findings that for boys, enjoyment is less tightly linked to reading frequency than it is for girls, not as a contradiction, but as a different orientation to reading. And at the same time, boys' accounts point to the limits of this functional model. When reading is sustained primarily through habit, routine, or perceived usefulness, it becomes more vulnerable to disruption. And again, boys repeatedly describe reading as most likely to persist when it's embedded in regular structure, but also how easily it falls away when these structures weaken as schoolwork and other demands increase. And as we've already seen, boys also talk very clearly about the role of autonomy in their open-ended comments. As they move through secondary school, they describe reading as becoming more closely associated with school and assessment, alongside a narrowing of control over what they read. And when reading feels imposed or disconnected from their interest, boys themselves link this loss of agency to declining engagement. So together, these insights help us understand the challenge of sustaining boys' reading engagement during adolescence, not because boys don't value reading, but because reading increasingly relies on fragile support, such as routine, usefulness, and external structures, which are easily eroded as contexts change. And before I hand over to Sarah, I'll leave you with these three key takeaways from the evidence next. First, the levers to re-engage young people are already known. The evidence consistently points to the importance of structure, autonomy, relevance, and access to reading that reflects young people's lives. These are not new ideas, but they remain unevenly available. Second, the challenge is alignment, not attitude. Most young people, including many who read infrequently, still recognize the value of reading. The difficulty lies in how well reading fits into their everyday lives, routines, and priorities as they grow older. And third, this engagement is less about rejection and more about relevance. Many young people aren't turning away from reading itself, but from reading that feels imposed, disconnected, or narrowly defined, particularly as reading becomes more tightly associated with school and assessment. And that brings us to the final question: how we respond to this evidence and what it means for how we think about motivation, support, and re-engagement. And I'll now hand over to Sarah, who will take us through that next. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. So moving on from Christina, I'll now reflect on some of the implications of research for practice. Next slide, please. So I thought I would start with a review that we published a couple of years ago, which synthesized previous research, which has evaluated different approaches to support teenagers' reading motivation. Now, due to the diversity of approaches which have been used, we applied narrative review principles and grouped the approaches into 5 distinctly different types, and those types are listed here. Now, across these different approaches, the different types of programs, strategies, interventions, we found that, first of all, the quality and the nature of the research was quite variable. And there certainly wasn't a specific approach which offered a solution in order to improve teenagers' reading engagement. Now, while I don't have the time to share the findings from this review article now, this is an open access research article, and there's a link within the slides if you're interested in reading it at a later date. But within this review, in addition to summarising the research, we also aim to identify gaps in knowledge and provide suggestions for future research. And what we found was a lack of reading motivation approaches which had centred teenagers' perspectives, opinions, or contributions. Indeed, all the approaches to increase reading motivation were almost entirely adult-developed or adult-led. And we argue that future approaches to support teenagers' reading motivation and engagement should be co-created with teenagers, centering their voices and ideas. And that's some of the research that I'll be sharing today, where we worked with young people to do this. Next slide. So this leads into the Young People's Reading Project, a 3.5-year project which finished last year, carried out in collaboration with a group of 6 teenagers who had input into the design and the implementation of the research, in addition to interpretation of the research findings. This study also involved in-depth interviews with a large group of teenagers, 46 in total, with a wide range of reading interests, motivations, and experiences, in order to gain their insights into the motivators and barriers to reading. But specifically, we were looking at book reading. Now, we've written this project up in 2 different research articles, one focusing on motivators for book reading, one focusing on barriers for book reading. But for the purposes of the talk today, I'm going to integrate the findings together and summarise some of the key insights. Next slide, please. So through examination of the motivators and the barriers, we identified 7 themes to understand and support teenage reading. And I think that what's interesting is that although our research adopted a different methodological approach to the research that Christina's just shared and was carried out with different populations of students, there are many similarities in our findings. For example, both highlight the importance of autonomy and personal relevance, in addition to recognising different motivations for reading. Further, pressures of time and other commitments influencing reading will also feature as I reflect on each of these different 7 themes for practice. So over the next few slides, I plan to focus on each theme in turn. I'll initially provide a quote from one of the teenagers who participated. I'll be clear about whether this theme was identified in our data as a motivator, as a barrier, or both. And then importantly, focus on what this means for practice. And in addition, while we focused on book reading, as you will see, many of our themes are also relevant to reading a wider range of texts, and I'll illustrate this throughout the talk. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first theme is that of access. And for each slide, I'll give you just a couple of seconds, first of all, to read the quotes from the young person yourselves. That's illustrated in italics. And then I'll talk through the theme and our findings. So the theme of access is really about teenagers having access to quality books, but also other texts which reflect their personal interests, preferences, and goals for reading, in addition to texts which reflect their lives and their identities, but also their reading skills and their reading stamina. In other words, it's about access to personally enjoyable, meaningful, and accessible texts. Importantly, however, it's not just about having access to these, but also having sufficient time and opportunity to access this provision. For example, some teenagers spoke about having a good school library, but just never having the time to use it. So within each of these themes, there's a report that I'll share at the end. We've created a guide to summarise these themes in more detail, in addition to the implications for practice. But in terms of the implications for practice from this theme, what we suggest is that teachers, school librarians, and other members of the school community update and curate school library provision with young people's input to ensure that it really does reflect their personal interests, lives, identities, skills, etc. Ensure that there are sufficient and regular library visits, both to the school library, but also potentially to public libraries as well. Make it easier for young people to find books or texts aligned with their personal interests and preferences, perhaps through different ways in which the library is structured. And encourage the use of technology to support access to quality books and other texts where it's appropriate to do so. Okay, next slide, please. So the theme of choice was seen as a barrier where young people didn't feel able, that is, confident or had the skills to choose books which were relevant to their interests, preferences or goals for reading, but was a motivator in the context where young people did feel confident choosing books and knew how to access these. So choice is really about supporting teenagers' skills to choose books or texts which are personally enjoyable, meaningful and accessible to them. Indeed, in secondary school, teenagers are typically taught reading comprehension skills, for example, but they're rarely explicitly taught how to choose books or other texts to support their personal reading practices. And in terms of what this means for practice, expanding teenagers' understanding of different books and text genres and types is important, as well as giving explicit guidance on how to choose books. Further, making it easier to find books in terms of how they're organised, using visible recommendations or apps can also support with book choice. Indeed, referring back to Christina's talk, in terms of what young people said would make them read more, finding books that match their interests and being free to choose what to read were important. But we do need to ensure that we empower young people with the skills to be able to do this effectively. Next slide. So autonomy was found to be an motivator where young people felt that they had a sense of control over when, where, what, why, and how they read. And in fact, the teenage years are a period of life commonly associated with an increased desire and need for autonomy. And this needs to reflect how we support teenage reading. In terms of what this means for practice, we need to encourage reading routines that fit into and are seen by teenagers to enrich their own lives. We need to help them and empower them with the skills to find books and texts which connect with their personal interests and own goals for reading, so that they can choose to read for their own volition. We need to encourage their input into book provision, class reads, reading activities, understanding their needs and preferences and enabling reading which aligns with these. And this aligns with a comment that Christina made earlier about meeting teenagers where they are and not where we want them to be. Next slide. So motivations for reading, in terms of seeing it as a barrier, it was often a barrier where reading was just not seen to fit in with young people's everyday social lives. But it was a motivator for some where they had supportive relationships which facilitated reading in personally enjoyable and meaningful ways, as you can see, for example, from this quote from a young person. So in terms of what this means for practice, if organising book clubs, these should be led by young people, centering the text that they want to read and share. In addition, recognising the value of online reading communities can support, for example, with book recommendations or to share texts. For a minority of young people, seeing others read could also support their motivation to read. However, reading role models were not necessarily their teachers or their parents, but rather inspirational others. For example, some teens spoke about sports people or other famous people. Next slide, please. So the theme of reading conducive environments is actually quite a complex theme with lots of sub-themes within it. But I think it really is this idea of creating a whole school reading culture. So it's about creating environments within school which are conducive to positive reading experiences. There was a barrier where there was a mismatch between what young people want to read and the ways they want to read versus how reading was taught or supported in school. But reading conducive environments could be a motivator where there was encouragement from teachers, quality books, comfortable spaces and time for read, and also support for their reading skills. In terms of implications for practice, this means creating a teaching environment that values and supports reading enjoyment within the classroom alongside supporting reading skills. It is important to recognise that some core or compulsory texts used within the secondary school classroom may put some teenagers off reading, and so to ensure that sufficient time and support is given to nurturing personally enjoyable reading habits alongside these kind of compulsory texts. Finally, creating comfortable and welcoming spaces in school to read and time for reading enjoyment can also support engagement and, wherever possible, extending or encouraging out-of-school reading habits. Next slide. So the next concept is that of timing competing activities, competing priorities, and again alludes to some of the messages that Christina was giving as well. Reading was seen as a barrier because young people felt that they had less time to read than when they were younger and or were more likely to prioritise other activities in their free time. Young people spoke about increased demands in terms of schoolwork, simply wanting to spend more time with friends or wanting to do other things. In fact, reading was rarely a priority for a lot of the teenagers that we spoke to. And as you'll see from this quote here, reading was also seen by some to be quite a lot of effort. And so I think in terms of implications for practice, providing time within the school day to read may help, with books and texts aligned with reading interests, reading skills and stamina. But beyond this, supporting other types of text engagement, whether online or audio, may help to support reading to fit more easily within teenagers' everyday lives. Indeed, behaviour change is hard, and as Christina said, we need to meet teenagers where they are and facilitate ways to integrate reading into their daily lives. Next slide. The final concept is that of relatable messaging, and it was seen as a motivator where young people felt that the messages that they were receiving about reading were authentic and relevant to them, communicated in their own ways of thinking and speaking as well. And some teenagers mentioned that the way in which we, that is adults, speak about reading, the benefits of reading, and how we promote reading does not align with their own goals for reading or their personal ways of speaking or communicating. We therefore need to promote reading in ways which are personally meaningful to young people through authentic and relatable messaging that connects with their own ways of thinking, of being, and of communicating. In terms of implications for practice, involving young people in reading promotion messaging could help, as well as linking reading to young people's personal goals rather than adult-defined goals. I personally would also discourage the use of the term reading for pleasure when speaking with teenagers. I've never met a young person who says that they read for pleasure. And in fact, this term seems completely disconnected with how teens talk about reading or even their goals for reading. So to sum, if we want to increase teenagers' reading enjoyment and engagement, we need to centre young people. We need to understand their motives, their interests, their goals, their lives, their identities, their ways of communicating, and we need to work with them to enhance their reading enjoyment, motivation, and engagement. Next slide. I'm going to finish just by sharing a couple of our academic papers, but also a guide specifically written for secondary school teachers and librarians, which summarises many of the research insights, with suggestions for practice that I've shared today, which have come from those working within secondary school contexts. Ultimately, you joining us today, whether teachers, librarians, or school leaders, you know your own students and student communities best, and therefore are best placed to understand how best to embed these types of ideas within your own context. Just to say, the Young People's Reading Project is one of a number of projects that we've run from the Literacy Lab over the last few years, focused on teenage reading. So if you're interested in learning more about teenage reading research, there's a number of other projects listed here, with lots of journal articles and blog posts related to each. So thank you all for listening, and I'm going to pass back over now to Christina, who will finish the session.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have loads of stuff on teenage reading coming up. We've got in-person ones, so none of those tech glitches hopefully happening at those. The first one will kick off in York, and then there will be a similar one in Plymouth. And then the highlight will be in July, when everyone comes together for a conference in Birmingham, where Sarah and I will also be present amongst loads of other thinkers in the space. And you can find all of that information and much more on these QR codes that we are now asking you to take a photo of to lead you to the relevant pages. Oh, and we also have a learning management system that holds all of this and so much more. And thank you so much for joining us for our slightly different perspectives on teenage reading, but it's always heartening when different approaches lead us to the same outcome. And again, huge apologies for the tech glitch at the beginning. Thank you so much.